With that said, I will turn it over to our leader, Curt Collier. Curt Collier has been leader at many different societies around the country, including Riverdale Yonkers and the New York Society, and now is the lead consulting leader at Houston and in Silicon Valley societies, has been a program director for the National Park Service, and is now a professor at Fairleigh Dickinson University in the philosophy of science and ethics. And so without further ado, Curt Collier.
Okay. Can you hear me online there? I got to share my screen, Joelle, one more time, okay? And while I'm waiting for that to happen, I should remind you that it's not Houston, it's Houston, just to get it right. But it's actually Austin, Texas, right? We say Houston in Texas, yeah. Yeah, and Houston in New York, right? So let me change this. There we go. And I like Lily Tomlin's version of that, which is where she said when she was a kid, she wanted to grow up to be somebody, but I guess I should have been more specific, she said, yeah. So, yeah, good to see all of y'all. Thank you for coming out. You know, I worked, always had jobs on the side. I'm not a person who could just do one thing, and I'm not sure why that is. I think it's a pathology. But part of that is that I just enjoy kind of getting myself out there and doing some other stuff. And I worked as a docent naturalist for what was called the Governor Deukmejian Wilderness Area. Now, if any of you are not from California, he was a horrible governor, destroyed the environment. And the fact that they named, the wilderness after them. So I'm looking for the Arctic Wilderness Trump, Reserve. So, it's just whatever the most horrible name, that's what ends on there. But I shared my screen, and maybe you could do dual side by side or just, there we go. And so, yeah, I take big groups of people out, and I would take them into the mountains at night to do a night tour. Now, this is right outside of Los Angeles, and part of that was to take them up this little trail in the dark, and then after that, I would turn around, and we'd come around the corner. We could hear coyotes in the difference. This is LA Basin area, and then we'd come around the corner, and there was the sea of lights of LA, which is great because you could see where the fault lines were because they didn't build on it. So it was this really cool tour. I got a write-up in the LA Times, or about that big of an article, and then so many people showed up that they told me I couldn't take people into the dark anymore because they thought it was too much of a hazardous. But I like kind of these kind of talks. I was so happy that David and Susan joined me to go see Neil deGrasse Tyson. I said, listen, you got to come with me just to watch this guy. And there were probably, 2,008 something people there. It was packed auditorium, and clearly we're not the only ones who like these kinds of shows. And they're very, very popular. And, I go into planetariums and things like that. So normally this kind of a talk would lead with that. So we'd be in some place, and then I would cue the spacey kind of planetarium music. There we go. Welcome, ladies and gentlemen, to today's Star Talk. So happy to see you. Imagine that you took a dime, and you took this dime, and you held it up and looked at the star, and then through the eye of Roosevelt, you would see that patch of sky. So that's how big of a space we're talking about. Imagine you're holding a dime at face view, right? I mean, at arm's view, looking through the eye of Roosevelt and looking at the patch of sky behind it. Is it a very big patch? Yeah. No. But this is what we saw when we did that. That's the James Webb telescope that is actually shining through. And that's how big of a patch of the sky you're looking at. You're looking at the same as if we look through this eye, that portion of the sky. Now, these things are stars in the foreground, but everything in the background, of course, are galaxies.
What year?
So this was this year. And so this is a pretty impressive photograph of just how much of the cosmos. And normally that's the kind of talk we'd go through, and I'd get you all inspired to think about that using some kind of music. But I'm going to do something slightly different, which is to kind of talk to you in a different way about the things that I say to my own students. These are the things I write that I'm developing for my own book on bioethics and thinking of those things. But it's a frame that I use, and it's a frame that I got not because of my own just thinking on these things, but I have no fresh ideas in my mind. They're all stolen from other scientists who kind of point out things. So I do want to admit, there we go, that I love this time of year. I hate cold weather. I cannot stand it. I wish it was already warm again. But there is something really wonderful about the night sky. I'm going to be heading for my own holiday back down to Texas. We have a big dark sky area out there. And then I'm going to go out to West Texas, and there's a McDonald Observatory. And all these people gather there every year they do it several nights of the year, for star parties. And we go out there, and you could see some really kind of cool stuff. But it's really great about the winter time is that we lose humidity levels in the atmosphere, and that's why the stars appear brighter to you. There's just less humidity and less light is being reflected back off of that. So stars begin to appear, and some of you have already probably seen the glorious kind of Orion Nebula that's out there. So winter is great because it allows for framing. I think what happens to me during the summer is I'm enticed by so many beautiful things that I lose sight of anything in particular. And in the winter, it kind of reframes everything, and you can look at it in a new way and the new kind of landscape. And the stars in the winter time actually appear brighter to us than they do in the summertime because of the less water vapor in the atmosphere. It's clearer and easier for us to see them. They kind of shine through in some really kind of great ways like that. They also twinkle a little less. Did you know that? Because there's actually less water vapor in the atmosphere. And we actually see them in much more brilliant ways. Usually this time of year, Orion is rising, and suddenly there are 100 people calling the police department because there's this weird alien object in the sky and it's going to destroy us. And then they often get on the phone and go, yes, that's nothing more than the star Sirius that's rising up, and you're just seeing it in a way. And it's usually only in, it's a winter constellation, but it's on really clear nights that people said that. I love this line from Mary Oliver, who says, I want to be nothing a little while, but the rich lens of attention. And that was her great dream in life, was to lay down and just to pay attention to the world for a while. And I think winter allows us to do that. We have more times to slow down. I think when we're running for our car and kind of stuff. And all of a sudden, there's this redwood dogwood that y'all have had, these red twig dogwood up here, or you have these things that have such beauty in them, and you have to stop, That's the difference between Japanese garden designers and Americans. I was listening to a talk, I went to Botanical Gardens, and they said, well, what frequently used to happen in American gardens, and not so much anymore, people just planted evergreens. They wanted it to be green year-round. And then the Japanese designer said, the problem is you lose the wonder of things just in repose and quiet and reflection. And just to see a stick out there with some apical buds on it, things like that, and how important that is, and the things that we have to pay attention to in our life. And the thing is that if you start to pay attention to nature, it's actually pretty interesting. It's this very deep, complex web of life. Of course, you all know that. How so much of the universe now we see more and more and more, and it gets explained to us than things that we paid attention to in the past. And what's interesting when you're trying to learn biology, there's two things. Often people just think of the collection of things, right? There's a red twig dogwood, there's this kind of plant over here, this is this kind of thing, this is this kind of bird species. Have y'all seen juncos return to your bird feeders, those of you who are doing that? I happen to like juncos. I think they're gorgeous. So it's just nice to see something like that, something that's kind of different, or see the cardinals, which have kind of been there in the background. But now without the leaves on the trees, there's this bright red thing that's out there. And you start to pay attention that maybe there's more than just the collection of things. And this is what biologists are trying to get people to understand more. It's not just the objects themselves that you have to pay attention to, you notice in nature. Nature is not just a collection of things, right? It's not one of these and one of those and one of these things and all that kind of stuff. There are other things that are happening in nature which are also present, but you don't see them. And you don't see them because they're not objects, they're processes, right? There's dynamic relationships. There's a mathematical underpinning to what's going on and this complexity that's out there. For example, natural selection. You've all learned in school that natural selection drove evolution, but there's no natural selector out there. That's not an object that's going, okay, no, yes, no, that kind of stuff, right? Nature is just there, and these processes emerge just because of the patterns of way things work. There's not a natural selector in the universe. It's not a thing you touch. It's not a physical entity. It's a dynamic process. And what biologists try to help people understand is stop thinking of nature as merely a collection of objects and think of them and this pattern, this thing that's happening, this dynamic relationship that's always in flux at the same time. And so the thing that surprised scientists for many years, for example, is why life continued to get more and more complex. This is something we don't quite understand. Why is complexity increasing if we study enough about math and science to know that entropy should be decreasing? There should be less order. And for many of the early creationists, and some of them still use this ridiculous argument, that this must be proof for the evidence of like a God in the universe who's making things happening, because life is heading opposite of the way of entropy. It's actually leading into more and more complexity. And the only way they thought that that was possible is there was some kind of an invisible force that was making this possible. But ecosystems actually tend towards greater complexity, right? That even when we've had, 7 mass extinctions, and we're heading in our newest ones, yay. We have all these mass extinctions that are happening that afterwards, when there are only a few species left on the planet, that within a relatively short period of time, greater complexity increases again. Now that's weird, right? That's not supposed to happen. If you have basically some kind of a pattern out there, and there's one of these and one of these and one of these and one of these, how could there be much more than that? And people never understood that. It really wasn't until we got supercomputers that people could even figure out what this is. Why is that true? Why is it that in this complex thing you see more and more life get created? Now, biologists were not the only people to pay attention to that. If any of you read it, Adam Smith and his Wealth of Nations, even in the 1700s, 1776 to be exact, that he could already spot that somehow a couple of people interacting in a certain way produces more than what they could have individually. Think of that. 4 of us working together, 4 or 5 of us working together, somehow produces more than what was there before. And it was for a lot of them like, what the heck is going on? Adam Smith called it literally the invisible hand. But it wasn't like the hand of God for him. He just said there's something that happens when humans get together, that more diversity gets increased from that. And that was why J.B.S. Haldane, the biologist, said the universe is not only stranger than we imagine, it is stranger than we can imagine. These things keep happening. Well, the universe operates like that, that suddenly you take collections of things, once again, and something new begins to happen that's more. Now, we finally had a term for that came out of chaos theory mathematics called emergence. And the emergence is just basically this, that if you have a bunch of things in a system and you add them up together, that somehow something more gets produced in that system than the parts itself. Aristotle was amazed by that, that how is it that 1 + 1 + 1 equals to more than 3 in a biological system? How is it possible when we're in a universe where we can have so many component parts, and we're so good at the math now, we can actually understand all the math. What are the inputs? What's the system? How much energy flow, right? They can calculate all of this stuff, and still at the end of that, there is more than the system should have produced. And with the birth of supercomputers, it's only recently that we can run the math and go, yeah, there's something about the way the dynamics of the system that it always produces more than the sole parts. By the way, Aristotle wrote the same thing 2,300 years ago. That he said, yeah, that somehow the systems, I mean, some people are just brilliant and they pay attention, that somehow more things are created by a few things than there should be, that should be possible. And so we finally had a name for what's going on, which is this thing called emergence. And emergence just is the term that means that given the initial conditions, given all the inputs and everything else, things kind of self-organize and generate it on. Now, once again, this is not some hand reaching in. This is not something. This is the dynamic process which sets up our universe. And it's a weird thing. We're still trying to grasp why is it that we can produce more than we possibly can. Now, part of that is they think that we're operating on what's called the edge of chaos, right? That the driver for this is actually entropy. So you would think that would be not the avenue for creation. Entropy should allow for greater amounts of disorder. It should allow for there to be less in the system. It should be a winding down, right? This second law of thermodynamics. Basically, things should be less and less and less. But as Ilya Prigogine said, between order and chaos lives this fertile ground of creativity. And once again, this is kind of new stuff that people are just beginning to understand. How is it? What's the driver for that? Now, very, very rudiment way of explaining that if you take a water wheel, and the water wheel's turning and you have some energy, some water dropping on it, the wheel will drop. If you raise the water wheel up so that the water is dropping down on the water wheel, will it turn faster?
Won't turn at all.
Will it turn faster or slower or stay the same? It'll go faster, right? So to a certain extent, it'll build up a little bit faster because of that, because of the distance of the water. Your internal combustion engine on your car does the same thing. Do you know that on a cold day, your car is much more efficient than on a hot day? Because the engine has more cold around it, and that warmth of your engine is going towards the coal, and your explosibility of your engine is more. So there are all these kinds of weird things that just happen in the mathematics that drive things. But we live actually between this sense of order and this sense of chaos. And imagine that as the engine that's driving things happening. It's not just chaos, and it's not just building more order. We actually have to have an interplay between chaos, between order and disorder, in order for there to be this engine of creation. This destructiveness of the pattern is just as necessary as the building up of those kinds of things. And that's what allows actually creativity to emerge. And so at this boundary is when this weird things happens, right? The people who study emergence say several things had to be in position for that. There has to be some autonomy, some freedom. There has to be some communication, you have to have what's called the law of requisite variety. They have a whole math about it. But ultimately, what you need in order for creation to emerge and for something special to suddenly start dividing out is just these things had to be present in the condition. And suddenly, this order produces something more than there was there before. And this kind of emergence begins to happen. It should not be heading in that direction. It should be heading in the opposite direction. But it doesn't. The system is dynamic. We're participating as a species biologically in this, and it's allowing that on there. Now, both Adam Smith and Karl Marx thought we could control that. Oh my God, look, if you do certain things, it's going to lead to more order. We can actually have this kind of stuff. They didn't understand any of this, as you can imagine writing back when they did. But for some reason, they noticed that when certain things are together, it produces more. So both Adam Smith from the capitalist side and Karl Marx from the communist side, man, if we could just control that, if we could just put it to have the right inputs, we could produce more. Both of them were moral philosophers. And ultimately what they wanted was to create a place that elicited our best and not our worst. Unfortunately, we know it cannot be controlled. It's nonlinear, it's non-Newtonian, and it cannot be predicted, and we cannot control it, right? This is something that emerges naturally, and the more that we try to control things, actually are less of our ability to do that. And we're just now beginning to understand that as well. It's like, wow, this wonderful thing happens, but it's not predictable. And we can't have any control over it, but these things begin to happen more and more. Now, what's interesting about that is that if an idea is good, and if it works evolutionarily speaking, then other things will say, oh, that's a pretty good idea. Let's do that. Right? Think of the evolution of the eye. We don't all evolve with the same notion of an eye. And yet an octopus has eyes. A jellyfish has eyes. Think of that, scary. Starfish has eyes. They're on the end of each of their extensions are their eyes, by the way. They have eyes. We have eyes. Mammals have eyes. All this kind of stuff have eyes. And yet those eyes are not related to one another. Right? They didn't all just have the same little gene written in there for eye. What they have is the potential to develop kind of stuff. But because having an eye is a better way to survive, it makes you most fitted, that the eye evolves in several different environments. That's why it exists. Not because it's got coded in there, it's the best potential for that system to operate. Think about that. If you have something that works, and if it's a good idea, nature will tend to gravitate towards that through natural selection and evolve that to make it possible. It's the best idea of the system, and it works in multiple ways. So people want to know, why is there consciousness in the universe? How did consciousness become there? Right? We're not teleologists, we say, or people who think that there's some planned purpose for all this. There's not, unfortunately. This is somewhat kind of a blind control. And yet suddenly we see one of the strategies that works for the way the math and the dynamics, the way the universe is tuned, is for this consciousness to emerge as well. And in fact, we know that there are many different forms of consciousness. Right? We have our own particular consciousness. Here's a crow using a tool. But everything has its own kind of consciousness. I love this quote from Wittgenstein. He said, well, if a lion could speak, we would not understand him. Which means the lion has developed a consciousness that fits their particular niche. And so if we have a conversation about them, they're probably not going to be talking about politics. They're going to be talking about other things. I love the thing about the scientist who invented the thing so he could understand what dogs are saying when they bark. So he puts the thing on his head and he walks down the street and all the dogs going, hey, hey, hey. That's all they're saying. So, right, that gets you. Dogs like, hey, hey. Yeah, I think that makes sense. So, but consciousness evolves into the niche that he has. And so it's a big problem for biologists are thinking is, then what's the purpose of consciousness? Right? Why do we have consciousness? Why do we have the type of consciousness that we have? And this is a weird, awkward thing. They've gone through all the math. You can read all the books. I'm a voracious reader. Luckily, I have that talent. I can read an entire book sitting down in 6 hours. You know, that's as long as it's about that then. But yeah, I like to read books, and I love the fact that sometimes I'm forced to sit on an airplane because I take a book and I said, this is when I'm going to finish this book. And I love that. So buy 2 books, one for there, one from back, and I'm a little bit smarter. But it's what's interesting about this question is these biologists and these cognitive psychologists and all these neuroscientists are trying to figure out what's the purpose of consciousness. How evolutionarily, why do we have it? What's the gift what's the reason why we have this thing? And there's recently been some pretty interesting ideas that emerged, only within the last couple of years. That maybe the reason why we have our intelligence is, remember, the system needs order and it needs chaos. And between those two things is the emergence of greater complexity, right? That's how life evolves. Which species on Earth causes the most disorder and disruption? So these biologists are thinking like, is this the universe's solution to trying to speed up the process of order, disorder, creativity, plus increasing complexity. Now, they make a big difference between chaos or disorder and purposely just being mean or stupid. That's not what they mean, right? And we see a lot of examples in that. But as Nietzsche said, well, why would he say this? But you must have chaos within you to give birth to a dancing star. And I think I kind of like that poetically, thinking of the ideas, yeah, what is the purpose of our consciousness? We are both creators and destroyers, right? We are Shiva Shakti. We are the builder and the destroyer, all contained together. That's the term that Oppenheimer saw when he created the atomic bomb. I am Shiva, the destroyer, because he both created it and knew he had released tremendous chaos in there. But maybe the purpose, one of the purposes for human intelligence is that it both creates order and breaks it open. And you see that, right? The struggle ongoing for us to kind of pull things together, and that for some reason, why do we just tear it apart when it served us so well, when it worked so well? What's the purpose of that? And perhaps this theory is that out of this kind of chaos, creativity can actually emerge. And maybe one of the reasons why we have this is that we have this kind of role in the universe to play that way. Now, once again, this is not just purposeful meanness. This is not going out there and I'm going to destroy order for the purpose of other things. That's not what they're talking about. That's not serves any purpose. But suddenly we have things that work, and then we break them apart, and in that process, new complexity always emerges within our show. This is the really interesting thing about studying television sitcoms over generations. And scientists, how many of you are still watch old sitcoms from I Love Lucy or Gunsmoke, Lone Ranger? Occasionally you tune in those kind of stuff. They're not very complex plot lines, to be sure, right? And so the question that begged for them is, was the audience thinking that those were pretty complex or pretty deep? What was up? Why do we look back at it now and go, oh my God, that was so simplistic? I love and hate watching television with my brother. It's nice to be with my brother and have a chance to sit down because we're both busy people. But he always says, this is what's going to happen next. Oh, this is what's going on, right? He's got that ability to spot the same old pattern that happens again and again and again. His was, what was that old 1960s, the lawyer who ends up getting shot and ends up in a wheelchair? Ironsides, right? He could watch every single Ironsides and tell you who was going to do what and what. He loved that because he could spot the pattern. Could people back then spot the patterns the same way that we can today? And it begs the question that we are actually, maybe the reason why we watch our television shows, and they're so complex with so many characters and so many storylines, in fact, half of them end up with just no resolution in ways that we want, is that, yeah, that increased complexity speaks to who we are at this point. And that would have not been possible if we hadn't gone through other kinds of disruptions. So here's the cool thing about this. Cue space music once again. Here we go. So the point of this, and this, if I'm going back to my space talk, is that we're not just observers of what's going on in the universe. That perhaps the role of humans is somehow participates in this thing, right? We've always tried to figure out, ever since Aldo Leopold, what is our role in the web of life? We've stepped outside of our boundaries so many ways, and the typical thing in environmental groups is to say, man, y'all messed it up. But maybe that's not quite right. By the way, you have messed it up, for sure. But probably because we haven't been able to understand the tools that we have and the gifts that we have to be able to do things like that, to be able to participate in the process of creation. Nature is not a collection of things. Nature is dynamic processes. That's what nature is. It's not a sum of birds. It's not amounts of rivers and things like that. It's this living dynamic thing in which we're all participating in. And that maybe if the planet is somehow experimenting with that. Carl Sagan used to say, We are a way for the cosmos to know itself. I think that's pretty poetic. I'm not sure I totally agree with that, even though if I worship at the feet of Carl Sagan and think he's brilliant. But I also do think that maybe it's not only to know itself, but maybe to participate in the creation itself, somehow in the complexity and the life and all these things that are emerging, that our role is to somehow participate in it. And that makes it kind of cool, the things that we do. So it's not that we're just screwing things up, by the way, we are, but we're also creating avenues for new complexity, new things to emerge, and maybe that's one of our roles on the planet, to be a part of that as well. And I just love the fact that you group of hominids right now have rovers on Mars sifting through the sand and crawling forward a few inches as we touch rocks on a planet so far from us it took us months to get there, to send these things in there. And these complex computers that we have designed to kind of look at that. So maybe, as I said here, our work is not to banish chaos, but to cultivate the kind that gives rise to new possibilities. I think that's ultimately what the universe, the Earth, and the biology want, is to ask the question, what is possible? And we're participating in that question. What is possible? What's happening, and what is our role in there as well? Thank you very much.
To learn more about us, visit our website, ethicalfocus.org, or email us at admin@ethicalfocus.org, and we'll get back to you. To make a donation, go to ethicalfocus.org/donate. Please follow us on Instagram, Twitter, and Facebook, and you can watch many of our past programs on our YouTube channel.